The Captain class received a lot of changes in Update 35 for the Lord of the Rings Online, including notably some big DPS increases and a sort of rework to how solo Captain gameplay is in LOTRO. So today, as we learn the new Captain, I am going to be taking a look at some of their new and changed abilities, as well as a deeper dive into rebuilding a solo Redline Captain build. To start off here, we have a fancy zoomed in window where we can see the abilities and how I currently have them set up on the skill bar, just in case that is helpful for you all. But one of the very important things for the new Redline Captain is actually going to be their solo stance ability. So because this is a solo build and a completely solo focused video, I am going to toggle standalone, the new solo stance, on, and we are going to look at all the abilities with that context. Now, as I toggle on and off standalone here, you can see some of the ability icons change, and with the icons changing, so do their effects and even the reference of their name. So something like Words of Courage, which normally would heal an ally, a targeted ally, it now becomes Courageous Heart and is a self buff. The other skills that change include Inspire here is going to be self-determination and gives you a pretty strong self-damage buff as well as a power restore. It has a fairly short cooldown as well. You will also see that, yes, your 2 Arms Blade Brother ability is going to turn into a Masterful Strike. This has a little bit longer cooldown, but a pretty similarly strong damage buff for 25 seconds of plus 30% damage. Where in combat res turns into a large AoE. It's a 5-minute cooldown, but it turns into a large AoE attack that debuffs enemy damage as well as provides a self-heal. That's looking pretty nice as filling the dire situation that the old in combat res would have for an ally. So I think just looking at these changes gives us an idea of how these skills and just how the Redline Captain in general will function moving forward. So those are the specific solo stance changes, but next we do want to look at the new abilities that Redline has that they did not have before, and notably Gallant Display is going to be a frontal AoE that tiers up. As you use it, it does more damage, but also costs more power, with power being an actual mechanic in LOTRO nowadays, at least for high levels, whereas it used to be mainly a low-level thing that you'd actually run into like realistic mechanics with it. This is going to be notable that the power cost does increase. This also just provides a solid AoE for Redline Captain to look forward to. Next up, we have to scroll down quite a bit. And another new ability that applies to all spec captains, not just Redline in our solo build here, but this is Defensive Strike. And despite it being called Defensive Strike, it actually turns you into the battle ready state, which gives you a huge damage buff, not a defensive buff. But the important thing is it puts you into battle ready state. And what you'll notice is you actually still only have 2 abilities. You don't have 3 abilities that move you into battle state because Shadow's Lament has been changed to just be a damage dealer. And it does have some traits that give it some extra impact and extra effects, as we'll get to. Another thing to point out is the buff that you get when you are in a battle ready state when you use Sure Strike. This will apply to all specs again, but that buff has changed, and in particular for the Redline Specialized Captain, it will now just give a flat % boost to damage, critical hit chance, and a decrease in attack duration, so you attack faster. You and your fellowship, I should say. And on the note of buffs like that, Blade of Elendil and its buff has also changed, so now it applies a fellowship-wide buff of increased light type damage, increased shadow mitigation, and increased critical defense for you and your allies. And just to be thorough, I did want to point out the Battle Ready buff does increase both melee and tactical damage for yourself. It also decreases your Cleanse Corruption cooldown, Cleanse Corruption of course being your corruption removal ability, so when you're in Battle Ready state, this will only have a 5-second cooldown actually, so you can use it a lot more frequently. Also for the battle hardened state, you will have increased outgoing healing and increased melee critical damage, but you also do get a defensive buff here for minus 10% incoming damage. And for anybody unfamiliar, in general Captain combat, it is ideal if you maintain both of these battle states because the buffs on them are kind of crazy with plus 25% damage and all the effects that you get with battle hardened state. I realize in solo gameplay it can be very fast-paced and you can kill enemies without really having to worry about that, but if you are in longer fights or just able to, I recommend trying to generally maintain these. And now we're ready to dive deeper into the trait changes and start our building of the Redline Captain. Now I should point out this character is only level 130, but he still has 92 trait points, and this will be a good, I think, starter point for just getting a sense of building the new Redline Captain. So as we respec, what we do see with speccing into the Redline is we do get the Relentless Attack, already covered that with the Sure Strike buff, but also when you score a critical hit on an enemy, you will give them an incoming damage debuff for 10 seconds. I also do want to point out something important when specializing with the Captain. You actually need 25 trait points spent to get the standalone trait and the standalone ability, which is the solo stance for the Captain. Now, I suspect that the low level damage won't be terrible up until this point, because that is actually one of the areas where Captain was relatively strong in the past. But let's be honest, all classes are very strong at low levels in LOTRO. So yeah, something you might notice is that the gameplay dynamic will probably change before you get this trait and after you get this trait. As we saw earlier in this video, just using the skill and being in the solo stance changed a lot of our abilities and their function and how you would use them in regular combat. So this is something that's just important to note, that it will take you a little bit to get standalone, and there will probably be a bit of a contrast between low level solo Captain gameplay and medium level Captain gameplay once you get this after 25 trait points. If you are curious, you actually get 25 trait points with the trait point revamp at level 31, it looks like. So we'll still get this relatively early. And with that out of the way, we can get back to the traits. So a couple things to note as we get into this build is it's probably not going to function like a traditional class or a trait build guide video that I would have if you're familiar with those, but more about just seeing what the new traits are and seeing what would be high value and relatively low value. So in the top row, we do start off with pretty similar traits to what we had before. So if you're curious, as a Redline Captain, Devastating Blow, Light of Elendil, Pressing Attack, Routing Cry, these are all going to be different combat state related effects for the Captain, or abilities that you use in these different combat states. Devastating Blow and Pressing Attack, of course, when you are battled ready, these do pretty heavy damage. Blade of Elendil on its own doesn't do the most, but this trait still impacts it. And also Routing Cry is going to be a notable one that is AoE and it can consume a defeat event. Of course, light type damage, you actually have a little bit more sources of light type damage than previously, but it is not a whole lot, where this trait screams out as like very impressive and hugely different than before. So with a quick double check of the abilities, our light type damage sources are notably Routing Cry as AoE light type damage, but also ones we'd use probably more frequently include Battle Shout, which moves us into a battle ready state in its range. Blade of Elendil as the battle hardened consumer is going to be one of them as well. And finally, Shadow's Lament does deal light type damage, and this is a pretty strong ability. So just something to keep in mind which abilities light type damage actually impacts for your Redline Captain. Anyway, as far as putting points into things in relatively high and low priority, always like things that impact all sorts of abilities and are pretty universal. So I'd get decreased attack duration and increased attack damage. And ultimately, in my experience, it would really depend on which of these types of abilities you use more frequently. If you find yourself using light type damage, that would be higher priority, while React to Battle would be higher priority. If you're using things like Devastating Blow and switching battle states pretty frequently, I should say, is typically when this one would come in as higher priority. But ultimately, that is where I will start, and we will eventually want light type damage, so I'll go ahead and put points in that. And then in the next row, there are quite a few interesting trait choices. All of them are going to eventually be taken if you're curious, but I will say that testing the new Captain pets and just changes with balance there, they actually do quite a bit of damage now, and getting this plus 60% damage on them will be very helpful in solo Captain gameplay. Typically end up using the Archer myself, also boosting their defenses. I mean, that helps them survive a little bit. It is also important eventually to get Telling Mark, just because that is one of your key abilities, and it's always good to put on an enemy at the start of a fight with them, even if it does take a second. And then for the other two traits here, increasing our bleed damage will be helpful, because one of the themes we will see is Redline Captain actually does have quite a bit of bleed damage sources. Well, actually two primary sources, I should say, and they just add up to quite a bit of damage. So Grave Wound is going to be a shorter cooldown ability with a relatively short duration bleed, but does more damage per tick compared to our second bleed ability, which is Cutting Attack. Cutting Attack, the duration lasts longer, longer, and it does have a longer cooldown, so you can use it less frequently. But boosting the bleed damage with both of those will be valuable moving forward. And finally, an important thing with Hardened Heart here is it does increase melee skill critical damage, but only when you're in the battle hardened state. So that is important to remember. That is something that we saw earlier when we were looking at the traded version of these abilities. Anyway, we can go ahead and get as relatively higher priority. It would probably be the archer damage, telling mark, and bleed damage, and then finally after that would be Hardened Heart for relative value. And in the third row, we do have Routing Cry attack speed buff. So when that consumes the defeat event specifically. So when you defeat an enemy, you trigger the defeat event. And then when you use Routing Cry to consume the defeat event, it will give you a decreased attack duration buff. So that will be pretty useful. But also Time of Need is probably one of the more valuable traits that we have seen so far because it is a pretty strong cooldown. It gives you a whole lot of stuff, putting you both in battle ready state and giving the enemy defeat response, as well as restoring some power. I should point out it costs morale, so that's something you might kind of ignore, the cost of abilities in general in this game, and it is important to note that it does cost a little bit of morale. It's, if you're curious, about 5% of this character's morale, but I have not tested if that's pretty universal scaling. And finally, in the third row, advantageous attacks will be pretty similar, I believe, to what it had before. So Shadow's Lament will trigger light damage when used on your marked target, and it just also increases the strength of that debuff. So all these are pretty valuable. I'd probably go Time of Need as the most in this row and Penetrating Cry as the least, but still, when you're high level and have all these trait points, eventually you will get everything. In the next row, Grave Wound is one of the traits that I did note that was relatively low value, because while Grave Wound damage does add up to a lot over time in combat, it's not going to be enough that there are just basically other more valuable traits than just improving Grave Wound damage up to 10%. So we'll ignore that one for now, and melee critical chance is pretty valuable because that impacts everything, and crit chance is of course a very valuable stat. We also do get some critical damage with that, but that's a pretty straightforward trait. We'll go ahead and put points in Grave Wound because that does ultimately impact our damage. And then in the next row, we have a pretty just flat up to 10% damage boost with two-handed weapons. If you only use one-handed weapons on your captain, even solo, which I wouldn't necessarily recommend, but if you do play that way, obviously this trait has no real impact for you. And then the standard, this is probably the first thing I would end up getting in this row because it is quite exciting. It gives you a good AoE damage to enemies as well as a self buff, well, group buff technically, when you are standing in the circle area for it. And finally, with the power revamp, I have been playing with restraint and putting 2 points in this, but if you never run into power issues, there is no point in actually putting points into restraint when you can probably get something more valuable. So with that, in this row, I would tend to find the two-handed weapon damage to be a little bit more valuable. But again, if you run into power issues, that is when that trait would come into play. And in the second to last row, we have first of all the trait on the left, which only impacts the fellowship. So if you're playing a captain and actually doing group content like a normal captain probably would, this is a good trait to give the fellowship your Blade Brother Inspire buff. But as a purely solo captain, as this captain would be, when I play red line, I would be playing solo. If I played group content, I would opt for yellow line or blue line on this character and try to fill that role. Otherwise, I would honestly end up playing a different character. So that is why this is a solo only build for me. And of course, that's one of the big changes with Captain, so motivation to do a build like this. But anyway, that is ultimately, like, I'd end up picking Vital Strokes here as the higher priority one, and actually never get this trait in this build was the point. But for Vital Stroke, this one's pretty interesting because it decreases the cooldown of Grave Wound, so you can use it more frequently and have higher uptime on that bleed, and it does improve the critical damage over time on that. I should say the critical magnitude of the damage over time component on that. And finally, taking a look at the last row, of course, Oathbreaker Shame is a very good short duration damage boost, well, to the specific target because it does function as a debuff to the enemy, so good to take out tough mobs quickly on your redline captain solo. We will definitely take that. And then finally, for elite companions, you do get a small chance for your pet attacks to reduce enemy physical mitigation. Even if that debuff strength is not all that great, it's still something that does impact our damage, and compared to other trait options, as we will see, you might as well end up picking it. So at this point, we have filled out most of the damage impacting traits and at least all of the damage impacting traits in the red line itself. So there are a few things to point out with the other specs. Yellow line will have a lot of self-defensive boosts and things like that. I think that outside of general defensive boosts, things like critical defense and things like routing cry stun duration, if you want to get an AoE stun on that, if you want the yellow line version of the mark ability to restore some of your maximum morale and even debuff the enemy, you could consider things like that. But I find the highest value one to actually be Call Them Out, just because that does boost your damage, as well as just increasing your max morale. You can get up to plus 8% max morale in the yellow line. So those are a couple of valuable things to look out for in the new yellow line. And as far as the blue line, there's of course going to be a lot of things that impact the healing. There's not going to be a ton for self-healing as a red line captain, so that is something you could consider if you want to boost your self-healing options, which are very limited. It's basically Rally and Cry and your one long cooldown with the in-combat res that gets converted when you're in the solo stance. So do just keep in mind, if you opt for some healing traits, Rally and Cry is pretty much your heal. Anyway, that is a long-winded way to say that we probably need to check for something more valuable, either giving us new healing sources or giving us some form of damage. I think one of the more notable traits for the blue line is going to be the ground target banner ability with the AoE damage, of course, but also giving you a moderate self-heal with these numbers, at least almost 1,000 morale every 2 seconds. That wouldn't be much to fill my health pool, but it would at least be a little bit. And basically this is a something is better than nothing scenario. And finally, actually looking up higher in the blue line, and what is a little bit more easy to get, Skilled Hands here in the top row ultimately would give us plus 5% damage. That's both melee and tactical, but those are our damage sources. Also does give an outgoing healing modifier, so it slightly boosts our self heals. And then we also do get, when you get a critical hit, you will briefly buff your damage by 6% melee damage. And finally, Rousing Cry. This is going to impact Rallying Cry, that when you consume the defeat event, so that kind of functions like, so that functions kind of like Routing Cry, where it gives you an attack speed buff. This trait will give Rallying Cry, the healing one, a damage buff for you and your fellowship. So with all of that, I would tend to start with the actual damage boosting stuff and start that with Reversal, which can give us up to 6% melee damage. And if we maintain that buff, if I apply this, we can actually see, we'll go into the solo stance as well, but we can see that applied to self on critical at the bottom here, it's a 7-second duration buff. So as long as we crit enemies with our abilities every 7 seconds, we can actually maintain that buff. Ultimately, that depends on how many abilities you are using, how frequently, and how lucky you are with critical hits, and of course your stats to improve your crit hit chance. But anyway, next up, I would get 3 points in Skilled Hands, and at that point, just because this doesn't boost our damage that much, it's 0.5% for 1 point in that. Rank 6, you do get a 2.5% boost on that, but I would end up finding more value out of the Rallying Cry damage buff, so I will go ahead and fill that out, and then I would backfill Skilled Hands. Now for my starter build with update 35, I have not gone more into blue line, mainly because the amount of points you would have to invest into stuff that is not particularly useful. I will say Revealing Mark is definitely a potential if you do want that mark instead of your DPS mark, as just something to consider the 2% pulse heal, but that can only trigger once every 5 seconds compared to the yellow line mark, which would be more valuable as a self heal because the blue line mark impacts your whole fellowship, so it has to be a little bit weaker because of that. And the yellow line being focused on, it would be a tanking captain, but on a solo captain, restoring 3% of your max morale when an enemy attacks you, which can happen relatively frequently, a lot more frequently than 5 seconds for sure. You will get an even stronger heal along with the debuffs and extra decreased incoming damage buff to go along with it. And then yes, otherwise, just to summarize for the blue line captain, the other traits here just don't quite provide enough value that I really want to try to get to something like the banner. It would take a lot of investment to get to that point. I will say though, if you are thinking about experimenting more in the blue line, of course, something to look out for would be increased tactical critical chance. It wouldn't really have the biggest impact on you, but it is at least something that's somewhat useful compared to some of these other trait options up towards the banner. Keeping in mind restraint as I look over here to the right, that if you are running into power issues, a great trait to pick as we covered. But at this point I would just get increased max morale for my character, and because I have to pick a trait here, we'll go ahead and get situational awareness. I have not covered specifically this trait, but basically why it's not useful is evade chance isn't going to be the best stat for us for at least a consistent decrease in incoming damage and basically a good source of increased survivability. It has even up to 5 points. It only has a half a chance for one of these abilities to proc an 8% evade chance for only 10 seconds, so it's just not something that's particularly appealing for our valuable trait points. That said, that is enough for us to get call them out, so we can quite easily get that. And here is really where I'd have to choose. I actually think that level 130 is a very good level to do a video like this because it gives us a good comparison. If we want decreased power costs and are running into power issues, restraint would be a great use for these last two trait points, while I would find that noble mark would probably give me more benefit if I am not running into power issues because it would help with self-healing, which in my experience so far with the new Redline Captain, that is going to be one of our limits of like soloing group content. Of course, that's not something you should necessarily expect with a solo build, but it is of course something that I'm personally interested in trying and just making my character as strong as possible with what I have. So in my experience, again, noble mark will ultimately provide one of the biggest benefits to actually one of our downsides as a Redline Captain, which is not much in terms of self-heals and sustain for longer group content fights. Again, specifically soloing those to be clear. And this is basically my starter build for update 35. I know I've done videos similar to this like way in the past with the Beorning revamp. I know I did one of these videos basically for every spec. And just to clarify, the point of this is not necessarily a build guide, as I have talked about a couple times throughout this. It's more of just a starting point and giving you all my thought process on how I think about traits and approach changes like this as we have had in game. Now I have, as I've also covered, I do have the context of the new gameplay and some experience with that going into this. So I have of course been familiar with how some of these abilities perform and relative power level of different things. And I hope having that extra context has maybe been helpful in this video and really helped you learn the new Redline Captain, what it is like, and what some building options can be for you. After I level my new hardcore captain, I am planning on creating an actual starter build for the Redline Captain, adjusted for whatever new things I may discover, and of course the actual progression of traits, because in this I just of course put all the trait points that I could in damage traits and then went from there. And in my normal build guides I actually go through the priority as you build it out, as you level up essentially. So I am excited for that, but of course for a more in-depth guide video like that, it will require quite a bit more testing than what I have done so far in update 35. Please let me know if you enjoy this type of video. Again, it's been a while since I've done one like this. I plan to probably cover at the very least the 2 Warden specs and potentially the blue line captain. I'm not 100% sure about the yellow line captain, to be honest, because that's the one I just have the least experience with, and I think I'd have not as much valuable input as some of these other specs. And that is enough rambling for one video, so let me know what you thought, and I hope you all enjoyed it. And if you did, please consider liking and subscribing for more, or becoming a channel member to support the content and guides like this. And thanks for watching, everyone.